Welcome to the 29th Annual Massachusetts Multicultural Film Festival. I'm Daniel Pope, the director of the festival, together with Sean Shimpak. This year's festival is guest curated by Laura Mago in the art department at UMass Amherst and assistant curated by Nefeli Forni Serfudaki. It's my pleasure to present to you Laura Mago, who will then introduce the theme of the festival, and our first film presenter, Santee Frazier, who will then talk about the film and also moderate the live Q&A and discussion on March 2nd with the director, Goulet. Laura.
Thank you, Daniel. This season's theme, Indigeneities, explores the diversity of Indigenous film currently being produced globally. In the early 2000s, Maori filmmaker Barry Barkley coined the term fourth cinema to describe the rise of Indigenous film as a global phenomenon at the turn of the century. Fourth cinema was something entirely new, rooted in community, privileging both Indigenous audiences and the Indigenous gaze. It was, as Barkley noted, Indigenous with a capital I, Indigenous film made by Indigenous people for Indigenous people. Over the next 8 weeks, we invite you to join us as we celebrate the range of expressions that comprise Indigenous cinema today: science fiction and animation, hybrid documentary and experimental narrative, performative video, and historic reenactment. The festival will include films by Zacharias Canuck and Tracy Moffat, whose work helped to define fourth cinema, and a younger generation of filmmakers and artists who continue to extend the boundary of Indigenous cinema globally. Professor Santee Frazier will introduce tonight's film, Night Raiders. A member of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, Santee Frazier earned a BFA from the Institute of American Indian Arts and an MFA from Syracuse University. His first collection of poems, Dark 30, was published in the Suntrack series of the University of Arizona Press. Frazier's honors include a fall 2009 Lannan Residency Fellowship and a 2011 School for Advanced Research Indigenous Writer in Residence. And he was the 2014 Native Arts and Culture Foundation Literature Fellow. His second collection of poems was released in 2019 by the University of Arizona Press.
When watching a film on or about Indigenous people of North America, audiences are often preconditioned to expect a very narrow representation of the, quote, American Indian, unquote. Generally, a figure in a naive, primitive state depicted as a helpless victim suffering at the hands of a technologically superior culture. This representation was and is perpetuated through a vast array of media, including but not limited to literature, visual art, film. Audiences expect depictions representative of the type of Indian they encountered in public school textbooks, dime novels, and Hollywood films. A lot of the times, those films, those textbooks are written by non-natives, right? As a way of promoting a master narrative, right? That is sort of, that paints the American history project in a favorable light. Generally, characters rendered in this way are expected to tour guide audiences through the trauma of an entire people, while at the same time divulging cultural secrets, also projecting a sense of cultural authenticity. Think about the environment, right? The untouched environment, the pristine sort of things that we associate with something that is sort of pure and untouched. The author Stephen Graham Jones calls this rendering native people as woodland elves. Right, so in some cases, audiences are given language lessons or even exposed to ceremonies. Think about A Man Called Horse from the 1970s or Little Big Man in the 1970s, oftentimes going through ceremonies such as a sweat lodge, things like that. Right, these are things that non-native audiences, non-Indigenous audiences, at least in North America, expect. This representation relegates the Indian to a historical context. While these complexities relate to North American colonial history and oppression, similar systems were implemented globally, which is why it's nice to see a Maori character in Night Raiders, right? Written and directed by Cree Métis filmmaker Danis Goulet, where we see the lives of Indigenous people in a dystopian future facing oppression similar to what Native and First Nation people faced in the 19th and 20th century, where Western religions and educations were weaponized to commit cultural genocide. You can only imagine the horrors Indigenous families faced when reservations were little more than internment camps. Yet these issues persist in a contemporary context. Many Indigenous communities living in reservations or reserves, as they're called in Canada, lack basic necessities. And keep in mind that running water, electricity, and all of these things were often promised via treaties, right? That First Nations, Native nations made with the Canadian and US federal governments. However, I think that there's a deeper complexity to all of this in terms of the way that education is sort of seen and used in Indigenous communities. And I think fiction writer and intellectual Sterling Holy White Mountain, in his article, The Blackfeet Brain Drain, published by The Atlantic in 2018, says it a lot better than I could. In the article, he discusses the complexity of leaving one's home culture in order to pursue a degree in higher education. Right? And we think about, this article is completely in a sort of US federal context, but I think many of these issues sort of persist in a Canadian context as well. Sterling White Mountain says, quote, "The relationship between education and economy is more complicated in Indian country than elsewhere in the United States. While access to higher education means a better life as much for American Indians as for anyone else, connotations specific to reservation people exist that trouble the situation. Going to school means leaving a cultural context, which includes many relatives, sometimes too many, that doesn't occur anywhere else in the country. Departing for college also means engaging with an educational system that does little to break the myth of how this country came to be, one that elides historical facts about broken treaties, Indian law, Congress's plenary power over tribal nations. This is not unlike Niska, the lead protagonist making the decision to allow Wasise to be taken by the state to receive medical attention, food, and other basic necessities. Yet it is the state that deprives Niska of the ability to be a caregiver. This situation is universal when we consider the word Indigenous in a global context, where oppressors offer salvation through assimilationist policies, a word that often pops up in the film. In many cases, salvation equates to social mobility. I hope you appreciate the dignity afforded to the Indigenous characters in the film. For example, the lack of contextualization of the use of Cree language and culture, the celebration and use of Indigenous knowledge and lifeways, where the characters do not have to explain their existence or culture to audiences. Most importantly, the emphasis on being part of an inclusive culture where leaders are accountable, responsible, and humble. I hope you enjoy the film. Thank you.